Throughout the late summer of 1914, Europe's latest international crisis just kept getting worse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire launched a punitive invasion of Serbia, which the Russian Empire mobilized to defend. That brought in allies on both sides, then allies of allies. The 4 weeks from July 28 to August 28 averaged one declaration of war every 2 days. Making the war quick was a priority on both sides, but especially in Germany, where the rapid entry of both France and Russia meant fighting on two fronts, unless a rapid knockout blow could take France out of the war before Russia's 1.4 million man army got itself organized enough to swarm the eastern border, which was why a smaller German force held the line in the east, while 80% of the army headed for the industrial heartland of northeastern France. To get there on schedule meant marching across Belgium, a neutral country with chronically underfunded defenses and, more important, with coastal shipping warehouses full of refined metals and minerals. In less than 3 weeks, the German army swept through the country. Along the way, they appropriated enough copper, tin, and zinc to run key war industries for over a year, plus 50,000 tons of badly needed nitrates, at the time enough to keep shooting for several months. When they got to France, they added steel to the list. Determined resistance stopped the Germans before they reached Paris, but the land that they did occupy contained 90% of France's iron ore, 80% of its steel making, 43% of its electricity generating capacity, and between one-fifth and half of its agricultural produce. French aluminum ore production crashed by more than 80%. France would be short of steel, aluminum, power, and food, and almost totally dependent on imports for the duration of the war. But at least France could get imports. In Germany, that was now a problem, since one of the British Empire's first acts had been to blockade the North Sea coast. The British Navy searched all vessels headed for German ports and seized any contraband discovered. Initially, contraband meant guns, armor, ammo, money, metallurgical equipment, gold, and silver. It took a few months to dawn on British planners that guns and bullets were not made from gold or silver, at which point they added copper, nickel, iron, chrome, lead, and pretty much all metal ores and industrial chemicals to the list of confiscatable commodities. A few months later, they put food on the list, too. Neutral governments and humanitarians protested that this unprecedented move would not only deprive the German military, but would starve German civilians in violation of international law. Legally, they were right, but the might of the British Navy made its own kind of right, and the list stood. Germany's imports crashed. Industry began digging into its pre-war and recently acquired stocks of metals and minerals, while scientists and engineers began what would become a long campaign of improvisation. Metallurgists found a way to reduce the tungsten content of armor steel from 30 to only 18% without losing performance. Improvements like that, which reduced the need for a ferroalloy Germany didn't have domestic mines of and could barely get from abroad, would become vital to maintaining capacity as the war started to drag on longer than anyone on either side had expected. For, contrary to expectations, late 1914 saw no decision. The Western Front got bogged down in the mud and trenches that would define it for the next 4 years. To the east, the war was more mobile, but little more decisive. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had started it, had nothing to show for its efforts but 3 bloody defeats by the Serbs and 1 by the Russians. Along the way, they had lost a third of their army, along with western Ukraine and the major oil-producing region of Galicia. A bailout cum counterattack led by the Germans, however, succeeded in occupying the land that contained 1/3 of Russia's factories and produced 1/5 of its industrial output. Cumulatively, the industrial and mineral resources that Germany had wrested from Russia, France, and Belgium would help keep her own war effort going while weakening her opponents. But getting resources was already getting to be a problem for both sides. Demand for nitrates, oil, coal, and metals had soared as industries began shifting to a longer war footing. By November of 1914, the German army was going through 20,000 metric tons of nitrates per month in ammo and explosives, to say nothing of nearly 17,000 tons of copper and vast quantities of steel, zinc, coal, oil, and other minerals every month. Figures for other armies involved were comparable, but rising demand met diminished supply. Much of the workforce that mined, processed, and smelted metals was now in the army, or had left mines for higher pay in armaments factories. Production was falling. The British and French could and did squeeze more out of their overseas colonial empires at gunpoint when necessary, but it wasn't going to be anywhere near enough. Everyone turned to neutral countries to fill the gap. When acquiring minerals from neutral countries, there were three common tactics. Either convince the neutral to join the war, or forcibly appropriate its mineral resources, or, as a last resort, buy them honestly. The Germans scored early with the first when the Ottoman Empire jumped into the war on their side. With them came the oil fields of Mesopotamia and vital resources of chrome, a ferroalloy that otherwise came almost exclusively from colonies of Britain and France. Almost as helpfully, the Ottoman Empire closed the Dardanelles to British, French, and Russian ships. This made Russia's Black Sea ports useless and, at a stroke, cut off the imports that Russia's industry depended on for 67% of its zinc, 98% of its lead, and all of its nickel and tin. Combined with Germany's occupation of Poland and other western provinces of their empire, it was a devastating blow to the Russians' war industries. The Tsar's military would need more and more infusions from allies as the war went on. And the Russian Empire's exports were cut off too, most importantly the Georgian and Ukrainian manganese that the world depended on for alloying gun and armor steels. Both sides of the war also attempted resource acquisition tactic 2 by invading Persia, notwithstanding its neutral status. Persia was not just strategically located, it possessed vast oil fields which, before the war, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had quote-unquote negotiated the exclusive right to extract on terms entirely favorable to Britain. Most of the result fueled the British Navy. When the Ottomans attacked and drove towards the oil fields, the British were alarmed enough to divert significant efforts to reinforce the garrisons already defending their interests, and to request aid from the Russians, whose army piled in to stake out advantageous positions in Persia and Persian oil as well. More distant countries were too far away to threaten or invade and required Europe's last-ditch tactic to acquire resources, namely, buy them fair and square. Nowhere was this more evident than in America, from whence came 65% of the world's oil, 42% of its steel, 40% of coal and iron, 55% of copper, and 30% of lead and zinc. Both sides of the war were ready buyers for as much as American miners would sell, or for as much as they could launder. The British lodged repeated complaints about American companies buying nickel ores from mines in British Canada, smelting them in the US, and then shipping the results to Germany via smuggling vessel or blockade-running submarine. The Americans didn't particularly care. But closer to home, neutral governments could be more cooperative. Denmark, for instance, obligingly allowed British authorities to confiscate a large cargo of Christmas ornaments headed for Germany, which had mysteriously been made of ammunition-grade brass. As the war dragged into 1915, the quest for resources moved from short-term tactical acquisitions to long-term strategic and geopolitical investments. The British fomented an Arabian revolt against the Ottoman Empire, diverting troops and, they hoped, Mesopotamian oil. German agents reciprocated in Persia, stimulating fractious mountain tribes to raid the Anglo-Persian oil companies' holdings. The German government also held massive drives to recycle copper, tin, nickel, and zinc from civilian into military use. Civilian metals were first requested, then confiscated. All scrap and household goods made of brass, nickel, tin, or anything close to it were required to be turned in for melting and reuse. That helped for metals, but fuels and explosives couldn't be recycled. Other solutions were needed. Early in 1915, Germany's Board of Wartime Raw Materials had calculated that Germany could sustain the war for at most another 6 months without additional supplies of nitrate. The Kaiser's government called in the aid of Fritz Haber, an industrial chemist who had already spent several years experimenting with ways to synthesize nitrates out of thin air, no nitrate minerals or mining necessary. Within months, Haber promised, he and the chemical company BASF would convert one existing chemical plant for nitrate synthesis and build a new one, for a total capacity of more than 100,000 tons of nitrate per year, and other plants would follow. The promise sounded outlandish, but Haber was an extraordinarily gifted chemist, and he and BASF knew what they were doing. By May of 1915, the first synthetic nitrate deliveries were underway. Over the next year, BASF would ramp up enough to supply German ammunition needs without a single shipment of Chilean nitrate. Historians estimate that Haber's process prolonged the war by about 2 years, and in so doing, cost more than 10 million lives. Nevertheless, the blockade was beginning to tell. German imports were down by half, and smuggling and confiscation couldn't muster enough metals, minerals, or food. Mining, steelmaking, and non-ferrous metal production had dropped by a quarter to a third each from their pre-war totals. In Austria-Hungary, coal and iron production was down by about 20%. For both, Haber's process provided enough nitrates to keep the army shooting, but not enough for fertilizer. German and Austrian farm yields per acre were plunging by tens of percent every year. By 1917, they would be slightly over half of what they had been before the war, with no prospect of improvement. Sectors less essential to the war effort, like textiles and civilian construction, produced maybe a third of what they had before the war. The word Ersatz, German for an inferior fake substituted for the real article, entered the everyday lexicon. In the Ottoman Empire, a Russian bombardment of Turkey's major coal mining complex had cut off their main energy source. The resulting fuel shortage hit everything from coal-powered railways to the coal-fired smelting of metals, the production of which dropped by 50 to 80%. As more and more men and draft animals were conscripted and the already parlous transportation network sagged under the coal shortage, food also became scarce in some parts of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan's government decreed that everyone not engaged in war must take up farming and turn over to the state all produce not required for minimal survival. Predictably, this led to hoarding, exacerbated by poor harvests and an Anglo-French blockade. Starvation became common. Annualized inflation hit 600%, and discontent soared. In an attempt to mete out some misery to the other side, too, in 1915, the Kaiser's government removed most of the restrictions that customarily governed submarine warfare. The new rules made any ship anywhere a fair target for U-boats if it carried an Entente flag. Tonnage sunk promptly quadrupled, reaching an average of almost 100,000 tons per month, or roughly 2 ships per day. Metal prices in Europe soared, steel by 200%, lead by 250%, tungsten by 700%. Before long, the lost imports and financial expense threatened to cripple the Entente war effort. So the British took to disguising their ships under neutral flags and, on occasion, to loading genuinely neutral ships with contraband, including passenger vessels. U-boats then began attacking these too, among them the ocean liner Lusitania, which took more than 100 Americans down with her. The resulting threats of war from the US forced the German government to replace the restrictions on submarine attacks. Metal prices stayed high, but at least metals started to make it across the Atlantic again, shipped to Britain and France, and smuggled to Germany and Turkey. It looked like nobody was going to run out of war material in 1916. So the Triple Entente looked for another way to tighten the noose. The oil that ran German and Austro-Hungarian motors came mostly from Romania, out of reach of the blockade and hitherto neutral. Lured by promises of Hungarian territory after the war, the Romanian government agreed to join the Entente, mobilized its army, and cut off oil supplies to Germany and Austria-Hungary. The result was one of the war's more spectacular backfires. The mobilization prompted a German invasion, and within a few months, Romania had lost most of its army and two-thirds of its territory, including the oil fields. From the Entente perspective, the one saving grace was that the Romanians had destroyed much of the oil-producing infrastructure before the Germans captured it. The war remained a dead heat. But things were beginning to tilt, especially in America. Relentless British propaganda and the damage done by U-boats had stirred public anger against Germany, compounded by a series of sabotage incidents. In July of 1916, German agents blew up a section of New York Harbor. The explosion killed 4 people and injured 100, destroyed what would today be $500 million worth of armaments awaiting shipment, and damaged the Statue of Liberty. Just in case that wasn't enough, the next spring, Germany's notoriously tactless foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, was caught telegraphing Mexico an offer to help reconquer much of the U.S. Southwest in exchange for Mexico's declaring war on the U.S. European belligerents on both sides had been touring the world with analogous promises for some time, but this was not widely known in 1917, and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram provoked an immediate negative reaction in America. Worse still, if that was possible, was the reason given for the offer. Germany was about to resume unrestricted U-boat warfare and wanted a distraction on the southern border to keep American troops and munitions occupied. But Mexico declined the offer, and the double provocation brought America and its minerals, fuels, and manufacturing into the war in April 1917. For Germany, the war became a race against time. The Kaiser's government was, in effect, gambling that the unleashed U-boats would torpedo enough supplies to cripple the Entente before the surge of fresh American troops and material reached Europe. The odds of this were pretty even. The artillery duel on the Western Front was using up ammunition, i.e. metals and nitrates, at rates that sometimes reached 3 million shells a week. And while demand was greater than ever before, supplies were being sunk at crippling rates. Entente planners projected that the British, French, and Allies could not sustain the war for more than a few months longer. Whether the Army's supplies or the home fronts would give out first was an open question. After 2.5 years of fighting, the industries and economies of France, Britain, and Russia were in deep, deep trouble. In France, wheat production was down by half, iron production was down by more than 90%, and other industries by amounts in between. Sick of fighting and shortages, nearly half the French army's infantry divisions had mutinied, and armaments workers were walking off the job on strike by the hundreds of thousands. The British Empire had lost no territory, but a combination of strikes, price controls, and manpower losses had lowered the domestic output of food, coal, iron ore, and practically everything else except munitions. Morale was in the basement, and the economy now relied on overseas colonies and trade for more than 95% of its metals. And in Russia, the continuing military, economic, industrial, and every other conceivable type of mismanagement had demoralized the population enough to stop work almost completely. Production had started to tumble. And despite being controlled war industries, Russian mines were especial hotbeds of communist agitation and labor unrest. Copper production would be 37% of its pre-war level in 1917. The chronic shortages of metal and everything made from metal got worse. So did public discontent, which the Tsar's abdication and the establishment of a provisional republic even failed to quell. So, as of early 1917, Russia was already in obvious meltdown, and it looked like France and Britain weren't that far behind. For all three, imports were the only lifeline. And as resumed U-boat attacks began to sink fully a quarter of shipping headed for Europe, Entente officers could not decide which was likelier, whether we blockade the enemy to his knees or whether he does the same to us. That, too, seemed like a distinct possibility. The German and Austrian economies were 20 to 25% below their pre-war overall output. Ottoman GDP was nearly 40% lower. Civilian food rations were down 70 to 90%. There were food riots in Vienna. Mines and oil rigs were producing barely what they had in 1914, despite vast subsidies and vaster demand, and output was sinking as materials and morale both failed. A sense of desperate necessity pervaded Europe. Each side sought to drive the other to defeat before it collapsed itself. The first to go was Russia, where Vladimir Lenin returned, the army went into revolt, the Provisional Republic foundered, and a civil war broke out, all in the space of 10 months. The Russian army stopped fighting, and, with the government preoccupied, the non-Russian states long held within the empire began to reclaim their independence. German planners saw light at the end of the tunnel. These had been the Russian Empire's biggest resource producers, and their newly independent governments were desperate for help consolidating power. A series of trade treaties were quickly fashioned. The usual deal was that German troops would help the new governments maintain order and power in exchange for minerals and food. In the example of Ukraine, which had recently produced 72% of the Russian Empire's iron ore and much of its manganese, the treaty stipulated the immediate handover of about 2/3 of a million tons of iron ore and assorted manganese, with more quotas to follow. Similar arrangements brought German occupation to the oil fields of Azerbaijan and leased all Romanian oil to Germany for 99 years. In the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia's new government formally accepted the loss of these territories, temporarily as it turned out. With resources secured and 750,000 troops freed up by peace, in spring 1918, Germany and Austria-Hungary turned to make one last big push that would end the war before the Americans arrived in force. There were only two problems with that plan. One was that the land of Eastern Europe, devastated by almost 4 years of constant fighting, could not produce what the German war machine needed. Oil production in Galicia, for example, was still only 61% of its pre-war level. Combined with fighting among Bolshevik, nationalist, socialist, czarist, anarchist, and half a dozen other ist factions across the region, even imposing the direct control of the German army that April didn't enable the starving economies to collect on their resource treaties. The second problem was that the troops just transferred to the Western Front found the Americans already there, nearly 500,000 strong and arriving at the rate of 10,000 more per day by May 1918. Behind them was an industry churning out more than 1 million artillery rounds per month, a number that was on its way to tripling by fall. And feeding that industry were mines, smelters, and refineries producing more oil, zinc, iron, copper, aluminum, and ferroalloys than ever before. The American war machine had between 2 and 25 times as much of any given metal as the Germans, and 42 times as much petroleum. For scale, the amount of iron ore mined in America in 1918, if smelted and processed, would have made enough steel to build one battleship roughly every 2 hours. That was the buzzsaw that the German spring offensive ran into. The troops gained 40 miles but were spent, and the land taken fixed none of the underlying problems. The blockade was still in place, the hoped-for resources of Eastern Europe were still consumed in civil wars, and the economies at home were still crashing. Shortages had spread. Now soldiers as well as civilians were ill-equipped, half-starved, and demoralized. Defeat was clearly a matter of time, and not even very much time. One by one, Germany's allies made separate treaties as their economies shattered. The High Command decided that Germany should meet inevitable defeat by going out in a blaze of glory. In October 1918, the top admirals ordered the German fleet to sail out of harbor for a final battle against the British blockaders. But the dispirited and half-starved sailors were waiting for an armistice, not a suicide mission. They mutinied. The revolt spread from the naval base to the army and to every major city in Germany by early November. The top echelons of the German government now recognized reality, even if the Kaiser still didn't, and placated the crowds by announcing he had abdicated. Faced with a fait accompli, he fled to Holland while his erstwhile empire proclaimed itself the German Republic and asked for negotiations. An armistice went into effect on November 11, 1918, and the guns stopped firing. The silence of the grave descended over Europe.